It was a chilly autumn evening, the kind where the wind seemed to whisper secrets through the cracks of the old house. Outside, the trees swayed, their skeletal branches scraping against the windows, creating a rhythmic tapping sound that unnerved me. But inside, it was warm and safe. Or at least, it should have been. My dog, Max, had always been a source of comfort on nights like these. He was a golden retriever, 10 years old but still full of energy and love, his fur matted and scruffy from rolling around in the forest near our property. He would sit by my feet as I worked, his head resting on my lap, his big brown eyes looking up at me with that unmistakable canine devotion. But tonight, something felt off. Max had been outside for a while longer than usual. I had let him out just after dinner, as I always did, to let him roam the yard and do his business. Normally, he'd come back after 15 minutes or so, scratching at the door with that impatient whine that signaled he was ready to come back in. But tonight, the whine never came. I called for him once, twice, and then 3 times. Each call was swallowed by the wind. My voice felt small, insignificant against the vast, looming darkness beyond the windows. Eventually, I put on my coat and boots and stepped outside, shining a flashlight across the yard. The beam cut through the misty air, revealing nothing but the familiar shapes of trees, the faded wooden fence, and the distant forest beyond. Max. I shouted again, the sound of my voice almost too loud in the stillness. And then I saw him. At the edge of the forest, just beyond the reach of my flashlight, stood Max. His form was unmistakable, but something about the way he stood, half hidden in the shadows, made my skin prickle with unease. His head was tilted in an odd way, and his body seemed stiff, as if he were frozen in place. "Max, come on," I called again, forcing a note of cheerfulness into my voice. "Come inside, boy." He didn't move. His eyes glinted in the darkness, reflecting the beam of my flashlight. For a moment I thought I saw something strange in his gaze, something not quite right. But then he broke his stillness and started trotting toward me, his gait jerky, almost mechanical. I shrugged it off, figuring he must have been cold or stiff from standing still too long. When he reached me, I knelt down and scratched behind his ears. His fur felt damp and rough under my fingers, as though he'd been rolling in mud, and there was a faint smell of decay on him, like wet leaves and something rotting. I wrinkled my nose but didn't think too much of it. After all, dogs were dogs, and Max had always had a habit of getting into things he shouldn't. "Let's get you cleaned up, buddy," I muttered, leading him inside. Once back in the warmth of the house, I grabbed a towel and started wiping him down. That's when I noticed the subtle change. His fur was still the same golden color, but the texture was different, rougher and thinner in places. And then there was his behavior. Max was normally full of energy when he came inside, bounding around the house like a puppy, eager for attention. But tonight, he was strangely quiet. He didn't wag his tail or nuzzle my hand like he usually did. He just stood there, staring at me. At first, I thought he was just tired. Maybe he'd spent more time in the woods than usual. But as the night wore on, the sense of unease grew. Max followed me from room to room, his footsteps eerily silent, his eyes always fixed on me. He wouldn't lay down in his usual spot by the fire. Instead, he sat in the corner of the living room, watching me with those intense, unblinking eyes. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to my overactive imagination. I'd always been prone to getting spooked easily, especially on nights like these, when the wind howled and the house creaked. But there was something about Max tonight that I couldn't shake. It was as if he wasn't really Max. I went to bed early, hoping that a good night's sleep would clear my head. Max usually slept at the foot of my bed, but tonight he didn't follow me upstairs. I heard him pacing in the hallway outside my room, his claws clicking softly against the hardwood floor. Every so often, there was a low guttural sound, almost like a growl, but not quite. It was too deep, too resonant, almost a human. Sometime in the night, I awoke to a strange noise, a soft scratching at the bedroom door. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The scratching was slow and deliberate, as if whatever was on the other side of the door was taking its time, savoring the moment. I held my breath, listening intently, trying to convince myself it was just Max. But then I heard something that made my blood run cold. A voice, faint, almost a whisper, but unmistakable. "Let me in." I sat up in bed, my pulse racing. The voice was raspy, unnatural, as if the words were being forced through a throat that wasn't used to speaking. I glanced at the door, half expecting to see the knob turn, but it remained still. The scratching continued, growing louder, more insistent. "Let me in." It sounded like Max's whine, but distorted like someone was mimicking him. Panic surged through me. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was someone in the house? Was I dreaming? I grabbed my phone from the bedside table, its cold light casting eerie shadows across the room. I was about to call the police when the scratching suddenly stopped. Silence. Heavy, oppressive silence. I strained to hear, but there was nothing. No more scratching, no more voices. Just the sound of my own ragged breathing. Slowly, I got out of bed and crept toward the door. My hand trembled as I reached for the knob, but before I could turn it, something slammed against the door, hard enough to make it rattle in its frame. I stumbled back, my heart leaping into my throat. "Let me in," the voice rasped again, louder this time, more insistent. It was no longer a request. It was a command. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. What was outside wasn't Max. It couldn't be. I didn't know what it was, but I knew I couldn't open that door. The rest of the night passed in a blur of terror. I didn't sleep. I didn't dare move from my bed. I just sat there, listening to the sounds outside the door. The occasional scratch, the low growl, the strange, distorted voice that continued to whisper through the night. When morning finally came, the noises stopped. I cautiously opened the door, half expecting to find something horrible waiting for me. But the hallway was empty. Max was nowhere to be found. I spent the next few days searching for him, but he never came back. I posted flyers around the neighborhood, called the local shelters, but there was no sign of my dog. Deep down, I knew I wouldn't find him. Whatever had come back that night, it wasn't Max. Weeks passed, and I tried to move on, but the memory of that night haunted me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting. The house felt different now, colder, emptier. And then one night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard it again. The scratching. Soft at first, then more insistent. My blood turned to ice as the familiar voice whispered through the door. "Let me in."